This is On Shifting Ground. I'm Ray Suarez. Misinformation movements on the internet, like QAnon, present trouble for foreign governments and institutions across the world. Conspiracy theories that originate in online chat rooms are gaining steam and escalating violence, even in countries that have long been cast as models of political stability.
We begin in Germany and major arrests in an alleged plot to overthrow the government.
A group linked to the so-called Reichsbürger movement allegedly planned to carry out their coup.
On December 7th, 2022, police arrested 25 people accused of planning to overthrow the German government. Among those arrested were members of the Reichsbürger, a far-right German movement that, like the Sovereign Citizens extremist group here in the U.S., believes their government is illegitimate. Groups like the Reichsbürger and Sovereign Citizens are certainly not new, but the ways they radicalize each other on the internet are new. Julia Ebner joins us now to discuss how once-fringe movements like QAnon are popping up in European political circles. She's an expert in disinformation at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue and spent years infiltrating online extremist networks for her book, Going Dark: The Secret Lives of Extremists. Welcome to On Shifting Ground.
Hello. Hi.
Who are the Reichsbürgers? Were they a group well known to people who, like you, keep an eye on extremist political groups?
So I was aware of the Reichsbürger movement because it's quite an old one in Germany. It's very unique to Germany. It's different from the US sovereign citizens because they really believe that the legitimate political system in Germany is a pre-World War II system. So they don't really see the current democratic structures or the system as legitimate, and they operate really outside of the legal frameworks. They've been around since the 1980s. But what's quite interesting now is to see that they combine their old school ideas with some newer ideas, coming mainly from the US, with QAnon conspiracy myths featuring very heavily in their ideologies.
That sounds like quite a brew. What are they borrowing in particular from either the Sovereign Citizens or from QAnon?
They've mainly internationalized what previously used to be their ideas about the German state and the German elites. They now talk about the global elites. And of course, they don't explicitly not always use the word Jewish elites, but there are some anti-Semitic undertones in their ideologies. And they've also borrowed from QAnon a lot in terms of COVID denial, anti-vaxxer narratives, ideas about pedophilia networks being run in the underground by the so-called elites. And they're tying different conspiracy myths together. So often you see that they also recycle some of the slogans and some of the disinformation pieces that QAnon put out. And there is a very significant overlap now of the Reichsbürger scene in Germany with some of the international QAnon channels, for example, on Telegram.
So somebody like you who tracks what these people are saying, it must be fascinating to see them cross-pollinate like this, to see a sort of strand of ideological DNA end up in another group's communications.
Absolutely. I mean, from a research perspective, it's surely been fascinating to watch some of these online spaces turn into international hotbeds, and where you really see that these ideologies are turning into a mosaic that borrow from different sub-communities, but then also use some of the older European ideas of the new right. And it's been interesting to watch that, but it's also shocking to see to what extent some of their ideas have internationalized and have also been mainstreamed. This plot really showed how many different types of audiences they are now able to mobilize. The network that was exposed by the German security services included a former politician of the far-right populist party in Germany, the Alternative for Germany. It also included former doctors, a member of the former aristocratic family of the Reuss House, and also people with a background in the military, even in some of the elite special forces sections of the German military. So these people have very deep embeddings within the structures and within institutions, and that makes them quite concerning as well, because of course some of them know how to handle weapons, they know how to tap into information networks, and how to even potentially use their institutions as a way to leverage their power.
As you mentioned, some of these groups have been around for a long time, but I think the the intention to topple the state ups the ante a little bit. From time to time, groups on the fringes of European politics pop into public view in Holland, in Norway, in Britain, and in Germany, but rarely are they reported to be contemplating trying to topple the state. Was this something new? Was this an escalation?
This can certainly be described as an escalation. We've seen plots like this before, but on a much smaller scale. And of course, the outlook of really being successful with a violent coup against the German government, it's quite a surreal outlook. I don't think that anyone believes that they would have been successful with this, but it does show how far they're willing to go. And they had quite sophisticated and detailed plans of how they would kidnap politicians, of how they would storm the parliament and overthrow the government, how they would try to trigger blackouts across the country and just create chaos in the entire country.
How do you tell the difference, though, between what's merely sort of brooding fantasies from people on the far right versus actual plans? There's always speculation about how these people need to die or how this government has to go and it's illegitimate. How do you tell the difference in your world between the steady stream of complaints and vitriol against established states versus something more like a plot?
It's a very good question. There are, of course, some signs that distinguish merely empty threats from actual credible threats. So in this case, the network had already, for example, organized weapons. They also detected some very specific logistical arrangements that would have signaled that they are getting closer to actually wanting to carry out the plot. So this was not just merely words. This was already turned into the first steps of their plan. And this is usually a warning sign. In terms of socio-psychological factors, I'm actually doing research at Oxford University where I also look at what do, for example, terrorist manifestos have in terms of unique features. What can we learn from them to see what are the signs that someone might actually resort to violence in the real world? What distinguishes them from, for example, merely ideologically extreme political writings. So that's quite interesting because there are several factors that could be seen as almost being part of a formula where that should ring alarm bells in the security services and in the intelligence community. This was clearly a given in this plot.
You mentioned that one of the people arrested had links before to AfD, Alternative for Deutschland, a right-wing political party which has done well in some recent German elections. How are Reichsbürgers different from AfD in their program, in their beliefs, in their goals? Are they really quite different animals?
They are, because the Reichsbürger scene in Germany doesn't really accept any political solution anymore. They really operate outside of the legal and democratic framework. They're deeply anti-democratic. Of course, the Alternative for Germany populist far-right party still sits within the wider framework of democracy. Although this is an important one, they have partly suggested severe changes to the constitution, to the way that the political system works. And it's also partly why the AfD have been monitored by the Protection Service for the Protection of the German Constitution, which is quite a special unit, but it's basically Germany's domestic intelligence service that did even see the party as a potential threat to democracy. Of course, the political systems of the US and of Germany can't really be compared, but it might be similar to some of the more extreme forces within the Republican Party, where you can see that there was an emboldening or an encouragement of anti-democratic forces, with election fraud narratives being at the forefront of their rhetoric. And something similar is happening in Germany with the AfD, where they really try to delegitimize the way that the democratic system works.
In your research for your book, Going Dark, you infiltrated extremist groups. How did you do it, and what did you learn?
I spent several months setting up avatar identities online, first of all. So I could be recruited into different types of far-right extremist movements. I also joined some jihadist movements because I really wanted to learn more about the human drivers. What motivates people who join extremist movements and why do they stay there? And I was then, by some movements, invited to also join them offline. For example, Generation Identity in the UK had a meeting in an Airbnb and one meeting in a pub that I joined. I also went to a neo-Nazi festival on the German-Polish border and joined several other meetings, also live in person. And it did help me to get a better understanding of how they operate, how their tactics work, because they did also give us briefings at some point about their communication strategies, about how important optics is to them, because they want to appeal to a more general audience, because they want to seem legitimate and want to brand themselves as something very separate from the old day neo-Nazis. So that was interesting, but also on a very human level to understand better what makes very young people sometimes join these movements. A lot of them didn't really know what they were getting themselves into. And some of them were purely attracted by the entertainment factor, by gamification of propaganda, of recruitment, where it all seemed like a video game. That's become something that I feel like is really dangerous for the next generations, because a lot of the extremist movements are very skillfully exploiting youth cultures, using satire and humor to blur the lines between what's real and what's fiction.
It's not just trading Pepe the Frog pictures or musing about different kinds of guns. If they're talking about illegal things, are they getting more careful about who they let into these chat rooms, how they screen people to get closer to actual membership?
They are now introducing much more rigorous vetting procedures and are much more careful in who they let in. So you often have to now prove yourself or prove that you're one of them, which has made it more difficult for researchers like myself, for journalists, and even for the intelligence services to really take that step proactively and continue to stay within a group. When I started going undercover with extremist groups in 2016, around the time Trump was elected, in the run-up to the elections back then, it was much easier. That was before Charlottesville. I was in the channels where Charlottesville was coordinated. That was just when QAnon started becoming a movement. And there were zero checks for infiltrators, or there were much less suspicions, which made it easier as a researcher to get insights, because now you have to be willing to cross certain ethical boundaries, because they might ask you to create a hateful meme or to run a campaign against someone. So that's something, for me, that was a red line. And I think that also meant that now I have to really pick and choose which extremist movements I can still get insights into.
There have been efforts to shut these places down, to chase these people off the web. Do they have to use more time and energy now to stay one step ahead of regulators, international law enforcement, the police in their own countries?
Yeah, definitely. They have been much more active in terms of circumventing policies. For example, they are using code words to escape detection mechanisms. In some cases, they're avoiding slurs or hateful terms or calls to violence because they know that they might be subject to removals or even to prosecution if they use this kind of language. So they've become a lot more cautious. But at the same time, there's also the emergence of a whole alternative tech universe where they make use of these newer, smaller platforms. They might not be as prominent anymore on Facebook or on the Meta platforms or on YouTube or on Twitter. Well, now Elon Musk has taken over. Maybe this is changing again. But they have resorted to other places in the online sphere. They've created their own free speech heavens where basically free speech was used as a pretext to also even post threats to violence, to post very extreme ideological messages. And there is a YouTube alternative, there is a Twitter alternative and a Facebook alternative. So there is a whole alternative tech universe, as I would call it.
I wonder what you think about the wisdom of that chasing them, forcing them to hide more deeply, to burrow into places that are harder to find, harder to see, whether that's really wise. I understand the impulse to try to shut down this speech, to try to discourage this speech, but if you take an 8chan and make them hide better, it's harder to watch what they're up to.
That's definitely true. And some of it has been counterproductive. So, of course, the advantage of the removal of really hateful violence inciting content or even calls to violence was that it would reach a smaller audience. Even if they did migrate to other online platforms, to fringe platforms, that meant they couldn't really take their whole followership to the next platform. But on the other hand, as you say, it's become also more of a challenge for the security services and the intelligence community to monitor what's going on the smaller, more hidden platforms. Many movements have moved to encrypted messaging apps like Telegram and others. And that is definitely a challenge in terms of preventing acts of violence. And also it has caused more grievances that can be used by extremist movements for recruiting more people, because the whole debate about freedom of speech has really turned into a major mobilization issue within the far right. And this is something where I would say that removal policies have had a negative effect on the discourse and have really enabled extremist movements to tap into those newly arising grievances.
Some of the ideas that are espoused by these groups are frankly nutty. Yes, they do sort of predictable mainstream things like encourage lack of trust in institutions, spread ideas about the illegitimacy of the state, and so on. But when they're talking about John F. Kennedy Jr. returning or international wealthy groups drinking adrenalized children's blood, it's easy to make fun of it, but just how seriously do you have to take it? When you're noting the spread of QAnon ideas, does the dessert go with the main course? Do you have to really pay attention to the broader intent to delegitimize the state? Some of this is crack pottery, but you've seen that it's appealing and viral.
Absolutely. Some of the ideas and conspiracy myths that have really turned into mainstream conspiracy myths. I never thought this would be possible. When I first joined QAnon and heard about the global elites being reptilians who drink the blood, supposedly, of young children to stay young, to me that was just so ridiculous that I didn't even give much more thought to it, because I didn't think it would ever spread to millions of people, which it has. And so it's easy to not take these ideas seriously. The same is true for some of the trolling elements and the satire and humor used in extremist communities. They weren't really taken seriously simply because they used memes as a form of communications. Back when I first talked to the security services a few years ago, no one took that seriously. Then the Christchurch shooting happened, where the entire terrorist attack was gamified to the extent that it was filmed from a first-person ego shooter angle and used this kind of insider vocabulary, gamer references, and so on. And then all of a sudden it became something that people took seriously. So there is a risk of looking too closely at the absurd ideologies and thinking, well, this is nuts. This can't possibly be serious. I do think that it's necessary to look at the overall patterns. As you say, the anti-democratic elements in it, the anti-minority hatred, and seeing also how this has always been the case. There have often been absurd elements to conspiracy myths. Especially in terms of crisis, we see that there is a rise in conspiracy myths. Even looking back at the days of the plague or at cholera, there were absurd conspiracy myths about the origins of those health crises. The plague was associated with the myth spread that Jews had poisoned the dwells, and that was the origin of it. Or for cholera, the myth circulated that in fact doctors wanted to harvest organs. So it's absolutely necessary to look beyond absurd ideologies and look for patterns that reappear over time. And these are definitely the demonization and dehumanization of an outgroup that is then tied to a bigger conspiracy, and that can then justify, unfortunately, also acts of violence.
Julia Ebner is a senior research fellow at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue and the author of Going Dark: The Secret Lives of Extremists. Thanks for joining us on Shifting Ground.
Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by Elise Manukian, Sienna Barnes, Adam Ailey, and Andrew Stelzer, with a special thanks to the Commonwealth Club. The episode was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Sport is our executive producer. Philip Yun is CEO of World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.